government officials. I met with the Minister of Labor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Social Affairs, Prince Naif. So we met with very senior level officials in Saudi Arabia. We also met with, we were able to visit some prisons and detention centers while we were there, and to interview many domestic workers. We want to highlight three main areas in our research. First of all, we want to recognize that many domestic workers are able to go and work in Saudi Arabia and they face good conditions. They will get their wages, they find kind employers, and they do not report any major problems. However, there are far too many other cases where domestic workers may face some type of abuse. And this can go anywhere from working very long hours with no day off, to being physically confined in the workplace, to physical or sexual abuse. And in fact, if a domestic worker brings a case to the police and the authorities, they are not taking action against abusive employers. And the best example of this is actually two cases. One is of a Filipino worker. In some cases, we looked at conditions that really amounted to slavery or trafficking. And while many organizations use the word slavery or trafficking very freely, this is something that Human Rights Watch does not do lightly. We really look at the definition under international law, and we are very conservative before we use the word slavery. And this is the first time that we have used this term for a report on domestic workers, which should show you how serious the situation is in Saudi Arabia. The first issue is that, like many other countries, Saudi Arabia does not include domestic workers under the labor law. So there is no guideline on how many hours a domestic worker should work, whether she should get a day off, whether she can get overtime pay, and she has no access to the labor court if she does have some labor disputes. In most of the cases we looked at, women were working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for years on end. The most common complaint was unpaid wages. In many cases, it was unpaid wages for a few months or several months. But I documented many cases, not just one case, not just two cases, but many cases of women who were not paid for 5 years, 6 years, or 10 years. And there was nowhere they could really get help. The second issue that is really important to highlight about Saudi Arabia is the kafala sponsorship system. In Saudi Arabia, like many countries in the Gulf, a worker's visa is tied to her employer. So the employer decides whether she can change her job or even whether she can leave the country. There were many cases where domestic workers wanted to leave the country and their employer said no. Even if they had finished their 2-year contract and the worker said, I'm ready to come home to the Philippines, sometimes the employer refused to sign the exit visa. So these women were trapped in the country. And this gives rise to many cases of forced labor. And just to give you an example of how extreme the situation is, in many cases, if a domestic worker was to die in Saudi Arabia, the embassy cannot send home the body unless they get the sponsor's permission. So when I spoke to the embassy of Sri Lanka, they had a woman's body for 1 year before they could get the employer's permission. And the same thing, I talked with the Indonesian embassy, they said it took them 1 or 2 years to return the body. And when I talked to the Philippines embassy, they said it regularly takes 3 or 4 months. So this is another area where we are really calling for reform, and I will discuss later some of the Saudi proposals on this issue. The last issue that I really wanted to highlight is the criminal justice system in Saudi Arabia. There are cases where a domestic worker may face no food from her employer, or she may face physical abuse or sexual abuse. What I found is very common is that if a domestic worker makes a mistake in the cooking, or if she asks for her wages, the employer would use this as an excuse to beat them. Many times a woman would be burned with a hot iron. Or I interviewed women who, if they asked for their wages, the employer would shave their head as a form of humiliation. There were all types of terrible abuses that sometimes led women to be hospitalized. We also know of cases of sexual abuse. And it's very difficult for women to bring these cases to the police, because if they go to the police, the employers may also come and accuse them of another crime. So for example, they may be accused of stealing or witchcraft, or if it's a case of sexual assault, if they cannot prove that it was rape, and it's very difficult to prove rape under Sharia law, then they can be accused of adultery or immoral conduct. And I interviewed women who had been raped by their employer and became pregnant, and the pregnancy was seen as evidence that she had had sex outside of marriage, and so then she was sentenced to prison and also received lashing. So when we look at a number of cases of women accused of witchcraft or adultery, the punishments ranged from a few months to 10 years in prison and 60 to 500 lashes. Our concern is that, and it is actually from her story that I got the title of this report, because this is what she told me when she described her story. She said, they treated me as if I do not have a family and as if I am not human. She was a 17-year-old girl from Mindanao, and she did not receive proper information about where she was going to be working. She was told she could also attend school. She reached Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi recruitment agent took her for a training for 1 week where he sexually harassed her. And she became very scared that he was going to rape her. So then when she was placed with her employer, the employer also began abusing her. But they said that if you complain, we will send you back to the agents. And she was afraid to go back to the agents because she was afraid of being raped. This employer actually raped her several times. And when she complained to the madam,